Good morning, audience. Well, we are here with Dr. Joanne Danko, author, writer, poet, physician of psychiatry, mother of three, and widow to the great Dr. Charles D. Danko. Dr. Danko, thank you so much for being here.
It's nice to be here. Good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to ask you, why did you decide to do this interview?
Actually, this is in lieu of memories, and let me explain to you what I mean by that. 15 years ago, I neither had nor expected to have grandchildren, and then suddenly our sons began announcing them. When I got over my initial surprise and delight, I realized that the timing was less than ideal because we could hardly expect to live long enough to see them grow up, particularly as they kept coming for the next several years. And why I would like to have been able to see them become older was so that I could teach them, tell them about their ancestral origins, about my late husband's family, my family, and also the families of their mothers, insofar as I knew it. I decided that the way to do this, I'd have to get it into print so that it would be available when they would become of age to be interested and want to read it. And I began collecting this material. However, in addition, I would like for them to have grown old enough so that they, as adults or near adults, would have known us as adults, so that their memories would not just be the memories of a child, of a grandparent. For example, my 9-year-old grandson was speaking recently. I didn't ask him about this, but he was lamenting the fact that since he was only 2 when my late husband, whom they called Papa Chuck, died, he didn't remember his grandfather. However, his mother, who was in the room, entered the conversation at that point and pointed out that when the camp that he attended asked him to write a poem about a hero, he wrote about Papa Chuck and made note of the fact that he was only 2 when Papa Chuck died, but Papa Chuck played make-believe tea parties with Madeline, his older sister, who had the good fortune to remember him because she was older than he. And this is what I mean. The memories are those of what a grandparent would do with a grandchild. Now, in addition to what I'm writing in the book of family history and memories, when this opportunity came up, I thought that this, in a way, might augment that book and give them an opportunity in the future to see what I looked and sounded like when they would be more of an adult age. And that's why I'm doing this today.
Fantastic. How do you visualize yourself, Doctor?
I think of myself as kind of a master juggler. Now, being a juggler is no news to any woman with small children who is also working a job in a profession, career, what have you, because whichever role you're filling, you're worrying about the other one and trying to do what has to be done to keep both operations moving forward. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about something much more difficult. In the first 15 years, it took us the first 15 years of our marriage to acquire our 3 children, and this was because I had a lot of obstetrical problems, each one worse than the last, and I was what I was juggling then was working on my training, my psychiatric training, and then having one of these pregnancies and trying to accomplish the pregnancy, several of which failed, and going back to my training program, and so on. Now, the juggling, as time went on, it became apparent to the obstetrician and to both of us that I would be carrying, that I could carry a pregnancy only at bed rest. And so it was planned by bed rest. They meant lying on the couch in the living room and running the household with the full-time help that we had, who took care of me in the house and one or two of the children as they were coming along when I was working on the next one. And while I was horizontal, I had to keep my mind occupied, or I was worrying constantly about the outcome of this pregnancy. Was this one going to fail or succeed?
Sure.
And so I worked with a clipboard, and I wrote several psychiatric papers for publication. I planned a study that I would do as soon as I was up and about after the pregnancy came to an end, one way or another. And I had another idea. Once the children started coming, I noticed that now and then there would be a completely unexpected, intimate, tender moment that would, like a jewel, that seemed to me worthy of poetry. And I thought to myself, with all the women having children all over the world, why don't we have any women poets? Well, not to worry, I will try to be one. And it turned out that I was fortunate because some of my early efforts achieved some success. I won one prize in an Ohio Poetry Day contest in a field of 100, and the judge was kind enough to write me a letter encouraging me to go on. So as the children grew, when something like this would happen, I would make my notes, and as soon as possible, I began working on the poem. And I collected these all the years until they grew up, and finally published them in my book, Into a Mirror and Through a Lens. This title was suggested by the fact that as a trained observer, I was focusing in on this relationship in these various instances. For example, when one child had the most florid Oedipus complex I've ever seen, dozens of times a day he would come and fling his arms around me and say how he was going to grow up and marry me, and I would tell him how much I loved him too, and think to myself, and maybe someday you will marry a nice daughter for me. And then suddenly, like a curtain dropping on the end of an act, when he came to the end of this phase, he said just once, "Mommy, when I grow up, I'm going to marry Whitefoot. That way I can have puppies." And I collected this type of thing, but it changed in nature as the children grew, and I wrote the poems and collected them in the book as I mentioned, Into a Mirror and Through a Lens. So I kept myself busy juggling these things while I was not able to be continuing in my training for my career.
But you were busy, obviously, in so many other ways.
So I was busy in other ways and trying to be productive.
Mm-hmm. Doctor, how has your career affected your becoming a writer? Isn't it a little bit out of the ordinary for a physician to become also an author?
Well, it doesn't happen every day, but I can think of several examples. Somerset Maugham, a novelist, a well-known novelist, was a physician first, and when his writing attracted attention, he gave up medicine and devoted himself to his literary career. On the other hand, William Carlos Williams, also a physician, wrote poetry throughout his medical career, and it's the poetry we remember him for. Back in the mid-20th century, an existential psychiatrist by the name of Rollo May wrote a novel-length case study report of a patient whom he called, to protect her identity, Ellen West. And it was this prolonged case study that gave me an idea for 2 books that I wrote when 2 of my sons had psychiatric problems, and I kept notes about what we did right, what we did wrong, what the professionals did right, what they did wrong, and this was intended to help in the management of these kinds of disorders. And then finally, there is a neurologist now by the name of Oliver Sacks who has written a handful of books about what neurologic lesions cause in their patients that can be very interesting. For example, his first book was The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. This neurologist also had the opportunity to work on a ward of patients that decades earlier had had Parkinson's disease, and it had crippled them emotionally, it had crippled them psychologically. They were a shell of their former selves. They were mute. They moved very little. They performed mainly only the animal functions. Then the first good anti-Parkinsonian drug came out, levodopa, and he gave them some, and the results were almost miraculous. They returned to almost to their former selves, but unfortunately it was transient, and they lost it. And despite trying to manipulate the medication and so on, they never had that reawakening that they had had on one occasion. And he wrote this up, and it's also in a movie. Now, in my case, I told you that I had written papers for psychiatric journals for publication, and when I was in my psychiatric residency program at the University of Michigan, we were expected to take turns in a journal club presenting articles from journals for discussion by the group and for mutual edification and so on. While I was wondering what to present, my husband, who followed the literature very closely for anything new coming out in rheumatology, which was his specialty, but he saw all sorts of other things also while he was scanning the literature, drew my attention to an article about 3 Eskimo girls, we now call them Inuit, in the Arctic part of Canada, who had schizophrenia. And this was very interesting because as time goes on, symptoms in psychiatry change like fashions. And in those days, in our country, you would now and then have a schizophrenic patient who had the belief, obviously delusional, that there was an animal living inside them, usually a dog. In the Eskimo girls, 2 of the 3 also had this so-called incorporated animal, and in their case it was an Arctic fox. And this illustrated how the mind uses what the environment gives in the elaboration of symptoms. Now, I was not satisfied with just the one paper to present, and I went to the library, got the help of the wonderful librarians we had there, because there weren't good databases then, and asked them to find me other articles about mental illness in primitive peoples in other parts of the world, which they did, and which I presented along with the Eskimo girls. I did not write it up at that time, but several years later, I was a member of the branch of the American Medical Women's Association, not the American Medical Association, but there was a special women's group, and our branch was asked to produce an issue of the journal. So they asked us who had a paper to submit, and I said I could quickly get one ready on mental illness in primitive peoples, and did, and they were happy with that and used that as the lead article. Also at the University of Michigan, we had another opportunity while we were in our training program to be working for a special degree, a Master of Science in Psychiatry. The usual Master of Science, MS degree, comes before a PhD. This was different. We were already physicians, we had our MDs, and we're in training for psychiatry. So this would be an MS after the MD, an MS in psychiatry. We had to do certain things in psychiatry, but we also had to earn a certain number of credits in the cognates, the disciplines that interface, that come up close to the edge of psychiatry, like sociology and anthropology and psychology, and particularly psychology as it is displayed in high-quality literature, like the literature by the Russian novelists, in Dickens, in Herman Melville, and I'm not even talking about Moby Dick now, I'm talking about Billy Budd, and other such novelists. So I earned the credits and the cognates, and then I still had one more hurdle to overcome, and that was the dissertation. So I was watching for a subject for that, and in the cliche of the times, fortune smiled. I was told I had a new patient on the ward to work up, a woman of about 50 who was severely retarded and depressed, and also had seizures. And I had to take the history from her husband because she wasn't even talking. He explained how they had her to a number of specialists. Besides the family doctor, she'd been to the internist, an ophthalmologist because she had cataracts, the neurologist because she had the seizures, and no one had yet elucidated the problem to bring her out of this. When I went to examine her, I felt under her jawbone to see whether the lymph nodes were enlarged, which they weren't. But to my astonishment, her facial muscles went into spasms. And I thought to myself, this woman has tetany, but why has she got tetany? That usually comes from low calcium. And I sent the blood off to the lab, and they reported back that very day, we've never encountered such a low calcium in a patient in this laboratory. So that led to the diagnosis of malfunctioning of 4 tiny pea-sized glands that lie on the thyroid gland called the parathyroids. And they were losing their function for no reason that anyone was aware of. These glands usually function so well that we don't think of them. We forget all about them. It takes something like this to draw your attention to it. When correct treatment was instituted, she recovered rapidly, and within a few days, instead of sitting there mute and immobile, she was playing ping pong on the ward. So she was lucky that this diagnosis had been made. You're always lucky if you have to have something wrong, that somebody can figure out what it is, and particularly if it has a good treatment, which this did. So she was fortunate, but I was fortunate also because I had a subject for my dissertation. And I went back to the library. The librarians combed the world literature and found 100 such cases reported. I analyzed them, I compared them to my patient. I wrote up my findings to submit for the dissertation, which was accepted, and I got the master's degree. And I also wrote it up for a psychiatric journal. However, because of the length of my article, they published it as a supplement to the regular issue of the journal. As a supplement, it was freestanding, and being freestanding, it was a book, my first book.
Oh, wow.
And that was how all these things came together.
So that was what led to the first book.
Yeah.
Wow, fantastic. Doctor, of the medical specialties, why did you pick psychiatry?
Well, what happened was this. When we graduated, everyone, all the new MDs, were required to have a year of internship, which we did also. During that year, we lived and worked with our colleagues who were a year or two or three beyond us who were already specializing. So we came to know them better. We noticed, first of all, that the psychiatric residents, if they had any time off, mm-hmm. and you had more time off as a psychiatric resident than you did, for example, in surgery, but the psychiatric residents were reading novels all the time. And I thought to myself, hey, that looks good. I like to read novels. I noticed also, as I thought about this, that psychiatry occupies a very interesting position right here between the sciences on this side and the humanities on this side. And when I say the sciences, I'm referring not only to the medical sciences like physiology and so on, but the other sciences, like astronomy, which is one of my favorites. And I'm a member of the Cleveland Astronomical Society and on the board. And my late husband and I and this or that son have gone to see a number of solar eclipses.
Oh, wow.
A marvelous and exciting experience. And one of the sons has become what they call a shadow chaser. He's gone off on his own to see some of these. I also am interested in paleontology, and Chuck and I went to help out at a dinosaur dig one time, where I found a fossilized dinosaur tooth. So I took it to our leader and was giving it to him, and he said, "You can keep it." And I said, "What? Don't you need that for the skeleton?" And he said, "No, we always get more teeth than we need. You can have it." So I'm the proud possessor of a dinosaur tooth.
Wow.
Now that's on the science side of psychiatry. And on the humanities side, I mentioned before how sociology and anthropology come up close to psychiatry. Also high quality fine literature and history and philosophy. And as soon as I was able to, when I got our youngest child into school full time and was able to control my schedule better, I joined a Great Books discussion group in which we read the seminal works of Western literature in an effort to discover how we got here where we are as a result of the thinkers before us. And I did that and eventually ran the group when our former leader was no longer able to do it. So that the choice of psychiatry put me right in the middle of all the things I liked anyway. And that was why I chose it.
How did your husband, the late Dr. Charles Danko, encourage you to become a writer?
Well, I wouldn't say so much to become a writer as that he encouraged me in my and our interests, which were sometimes the same and sometimes different. Now, I already told you how he found me the article about the 3 Inuit girls with schizophrenia.
Right.
Another time when I was at bed rest with one of these pregnancies, he came in with a newspaper. He was more of a newspaper reader than I. And he said, "Now here's something that you may be interested in." And he produced an article about the then new society in this country for membership in which you had to demonstrate an IQ in the upper 2%, the Mensa Society. And there was a branch of this in Columbus where we were living at the time. However, and I would have found out about it sooner or later one way or another, but in that article, they made the point that members are willing to be studied as subjects by qualified researchers. And I thought to myself, qualified researchers, hey, that's me. These people have assembled a study population for me, namely a group of people with one identifying characteristic, this high IQ. And what would I like to learn about them? So I was horizontal with my clipboard, and I planned my questionnaire study that I did when I was up and around, and that time the baby was born. I ran my questions. I had about 25 questions. They were all open-ended. None of this check 1 through 7 or anything like that. They were encouraged to take their answer wherever it led them and be as imaginative as they could be with it, and even add pages to the page that I gave them if they wished, and many of them did, and some of them said they'd never had as much fun taking a questionnaire as they did this time. A few years later, our lives brought us to the Cleveland area, and we transferred to the Northeast Ohio branch, and I ran the same questionnaire on that group. So between the two branches, I had 159 responses, and I took all of the answers to each one of the questions at a time, arranged them all out, made what sense I could out of them, and that became one chapter. And that became, that collection, those findings became my second book, Through the Keyhole at Gifted Men and Women, with the subtitle about this being a study on 159 members of the Mensa Society. So that was how he got me interested in the Mensa Society in Columbus. Then, as I said, he was more of a newspaper reader than I, and he was becoming aware of how ecotourism was coming in, how a tour would take you to some place where you could see interesting animals in the wild. And the first one that he found was a trip up to Churchill on the Hudson Bay in Canada in October, when the snow was already 3 feet deep, and the polar bears were assembling there to go out on the ice, which was where they spent the winter. And we did that, but we, over the years, did a number of other eco tours to see various things of interest, like the seals in the St. Lawrence River, wow, on the islands and on the ice of the St. Lawrence River, and travels to Antarctica and the Arctic and Africa, and so on. Then, as I was doing these things, often we would almost always see what they took us to see, because they had good guides who knew where to take us and find the animal and so on. However, sometimes there would be something like an aha moment when I would realize that this particular situation had a lesson or something to say to our species and was poetry worthy. So this was how I began my collection of nature poems. For example, we had to climb 4 hours almost straight up to see the gorillas in Central Africa. Oh, and there were the patriarch and 2 or 3 females and all of their offspring. And the 500-pound silverback, the father of this group, was sitting there actually babysitting. He had a little kid playing on one shoulder and another one sitting on his lap sucking on her toe. And I thought, this is a lesson to our species in how to be a father.
Yes.
And this was one of my nature poems. which I eventually collected under the title of Interlink, which was the name of one of the poems and had to do with our interrelationship with all the other species.
Such interesting stories. Doctor, what life experiences did you use as a basis to complete your books?
Well, I've already told you about several of them.
Yes, you have.
The having the children and writing about the jewel-like moments that I experienced as they were growing up to adult life, and about the nature experiences that became the nature poem. I told you about how Rollo May's book, in which he did a prolonged case study of Ellen West, as he called her, gave me the idea to write this type of thing about when our two sons had psychiatric problems. Also, as the wife for a little bit over 50 years of Charles Denko, I was in a good position to write a biography of him, but it was a biography with a difference. I didn't want this just to be a wife saying how wonderful the husband had been. I wanted the visions or the observations of others to be included, and I had several of them write vignettes to be included in this about what they had learned from him, what he had meant to them, and so on. The children did this, a nephew did this, a colleague did this, who had helped him in his final years when he was in decline. The colleague helped him get his data in shape for publication when he was no longer able to do it. And he has written about what he had learned from my late husband, also the husband of my roommate in college, whom we had visited back and forth, and how impressed he was with what Chuck did when moving became more difficult for him, when he had recurrent polio and the beginning of Parkinson's disease, and walking and climbing stairs became more difficult for him, and that was written by someone else. And so I was in a good position to write the biography, which I am now in the process of not redoing, but preparing a shortened and simplified form of it for use in middle and high schools, in hopes that the young can sometimes see someone like this as a role model. And I'm calling, and the title in this version will be A Quiet Hero, The Life of Charles W. Denko. Finally, back in the 70s, in Harper's Magazine, there was a marvelous article, quite short, 7 or 8 pages, on the topic of envy. And this article hit me between the eyes. I thought to myself, so that's why I felt so awful when such and such happened. Or, so that's why I avoid, whenever possible, being with so-and-so. Because I'm envious and ashamed of being envious, because nice people wouldn't feel that way, and at the same time making the effort to conceal the fact. All of this is difficult. So I saved the article, but I began collecting examples of envy in myself and others, in the family and patients, friends, but also in literature. And I have found envy going all the way back to the oldest recorded literature, the Gilgamesh epic. The Bible is full of envy. Ancient mythology has various examples of envy. Medieval literature used envy a great deal, and that was the time when the 7 deadly sins were defined, and envy was one of them. Not only was envy one of them, but it was the only one that has not a moment of pleasure accompanying it, the way gluttony has, for example. And envy is in the Divine Comedy, it's in Paradise Lost, it's in the Fairy Queen, it's in other lesser-known medieval works, and it's also in many modern works. I collected these over a period of about 30 years, and then I wrote what I consider my chef-d'oeuvre, which is my book on the topic of envy. Subtitle, one word, 4 letters long, Envy, and the subtitle is a survey of his history and psychology. Wow. And that was how I acquired, how I used what had been given to me by chance or circumstance, and did what I could with it.
Well, I know so many people are grateful that you did what you could with it. Dr. Danko, how do you expect to grab your readers' attention through your writing style?
Actually, that's one thing I don't try to do. I have the feeling that they must be interested in my topic. And if they're interested in my topic, I put my effort in making it as clear and logical for them to follow as I possibly can, for them to understand, for me to transmit from my brain into their brain exactly what I'm thinking about and trying to do. Now, I told myself long ago that content has to trump form. What I say is more important, actually, than how I say it, except that how I say it has to be as understandable as possible. Also, everything I write has to be scientifically accurate. If I have to look up things for the poems, for example, for the nature poems, they are, I check on the facts of the animals that I write about, for example. And in those cases also, in poetry, even more than the other, I try to write it as beautifully as I can. But the bottom line is that what I write has to be accurate. Mm-hmm. And those who are interested in that will read it and I trust understand it. And that's what I try for, not to be flamboyant or somehow have my style advertise itself. Not that.
So you're writing from the heart.
Right.
So now, Doctor, on to a more personal note. Who are some of your favorite heroes?
Well, actually, I'll tell you about some of my heroines.
Ah, okay.
In the 12th century, Hildegard von Bingen. In the 14th century, Queen Jadwiga of Poland. A century later, in the 15th century, Galileo's daughter Virginia. And at the turn between the 19th and 20th century, a little Polish girl by the name of Maria Sklodowska.
Oh my. Now I've got to ask you, why have you chosen them?
Well, Hildegard was born into a well-to-do family of the nobility, but they chose not to keep her in the home, but to send her to the convent as you would to a boarding school, so that she would be educated. They did not lose contact with her. They didn't just drop her off there, but she was sent there, and that was where she spent her life. And she was educated and developed a multitude of talents. By the time she grew up, she wrote poetry and plays and music that the nuns would put on. In addition, when the Mother Superior died, she took over her position and built another convent for the nuns. And in a way, one of the most remarkable things for a woman in that age, she stood up to the bishop on behalf of her nuns and prevailed. Now, she was centuries before the Renaissance, but she was what we would now call a Renaissance woman because of the multiplicity of her talents and abilities. And I think that if she had been a man, we would have all been aware of her and her accomplishments in a way that were not of women's accomplishments. Queen Jadwiga was the wife of King Jagiello of Poland when Krakow was the capital. And several decades, I think about 30 years before he ascended the throne, an earlier king, Casimir III, founded a university. It was one of the oldest of the universities in Europe. However, Casimir died and was unable to work with it and get it launched. So that when Jagiello came along, he picked up the project. He renamed it for himself, the Jagiellonian University, and his wife, Queen Jadwiga, was so excited about the thought of a university right in Krakow, even though she wouldn't be going to it being a woman,
right,
that she came up with a marvelous idea. In those days, one of the royal perks was that the proceeds from the salt mine went to the king. And there was a lot of money coming from the salt mine. Salt was very valuable because it was used for preserving food. And Queen Jadwiga persuaded him to allocate his royalties from the salt mine to the university so it would have ongoing support. Bright woman.
yes.
Not only that, but she sold her jewels to endow a chair. And that gives me goose pimples to think of it.
Yes.
They often, just because she was of the nobility and a queen, they often did not even educate them because they always had servants to read to them if necessary. I don't know. I never found it stated whether she was even literate or not. And still this woman was such a staunch supporter of this university. And when we were in Krakow, we went to visit it. I had heard about it from someone I met on a trip who had received an honorary degree from there, in, a professor of philosophy. And so we went to visit and went to the museum. And in the museum, we were shown a book in which their most illustrious old grad had been matriculated and the tuition paid. And this illustrious old grad was Nicholas Copernicus. A century later, Galileo was building on what Copernicus had done. He was also having 3 children by the housekeeper. Now, in those days, an illegitimate person could not expect any self-respecting person to marry them. And Galileo wondered how he was going to handle this problem. He had a son and 2 daughters. The son was a no-good wastrel who would come to his father for money to cover his gambling debts. But Galileo went to the Vatican and got an indulgence or one of those things that they had and paid to have him legitimized. So then he was able to marry a woman at his own level, and we didn't hear from him anymore. Galileo solved the problem of the 2 daughters by putting them in a convent. And not any convent, but a convent in which they could not leave the grounds for the rest of their lives. Virginia, the daughter that I'm interested in, did several important things at the convent. From the convent, she ran her father's household, which was several miles down the road, with the servants running back and forth, and she told them what to do. She also was a professional woman of her time. She gathered plants and herbs and used them medicinally in the treatment of patients. She was a healer.
Yes.
And in some ways, most important of all, she prepared her father's manuscript for publication, the Dialogue of the Two World Systems, the one that got Galileo into trouble. And she apparently didn't resent her father's favoritism to the son. Evidently, everybody agreed that in those days you had to do right by the son, but not by the daughters. And in his way, he loved her, and she died at a relatively young age on the convent grounds, as she had had to do. Mm-hmm. But she had done these accomplishments in the meantime. And late in the 1900s, a little girl, Maria, was going to school in Poland when Poland was under Russia, and Russia was hoping to keep it that way. So they put out an edict that the schools had to be taught in Russian because they wanted everybody to grow up speaking Russian. Then they would send inspectors around to see whether it was being done. And when they did this in Maria's school, they always called her to recite because she was the smartest kid in the school, and she could handle the Russian very well. And the inspectors would be satisfied and go away and leave them in peace. Then when she grew up, she went to Paris to further her studies in yet her third language, which would be French now, by being in Paris. And she studied things that are difficult enough in English, physics and calculus. And we know her by her married name, Curie, under which she won 2 Nobel Prizes, one with her husband Pierre and one with her daughter Eve. And when I was growing up, her biography was popular. I read that, and she became my role model. And that's why these are my heroines.
And now they're mine.
And now they're yours.
Yes, thank you for sharing those stories.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Danko, I'm sure you have some favorite books of your own. Will you share some of those with us?
Well, let me tell you about some that are less well known.
Okay.
There was a British author, W.E. Hudson, whose father took the family to Argentina to try to make his fortune as a cattle rancher. And that was not terribly successful, but while they were there was no school nearby. They had to hire a tutor. Often the tutor was not particularly good, might turn up drunk, what might have to be fired, and another one hired a month or two later. And in the meantime, these children could wander on the pampas and observe the animals and birds and plants and have a marvelous growing up experience in Argentina. And about this, W.H. Hudson wrote his memoir, Long Ago and Far Away, which is one that I'm recommending. He also wrote a novel set farther north in the tropical jungle along the Orinoco River in Venezuela called Green Mansions. And it's a romantic novel, and I like that one. There's another book that I like so much that I have bought copies of it to leave to all of my grandchildren because I'm not sure it'll be available in the future, by Leonard Cottrell, with a marvelous title, The Anvil of Civilization. And this book compares the 2 most ancient civilizations in the West, Egypt and Mesopotamia, and among other things, the reasons for the differences between them, relating to Egypt being in the desert with the Nile bringing in the water, in contrast to in open plains area with the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, which later became a number of different countries. Another book I'd like to mention was very popular in Europe about 40 years ago and never that popular in this country. It was written in French, but then, of course, translated into English. It was by the French author Jean Raspail, and it was called The Camp of the Saints, but I considered that a very poor name. It said nothing, it didn't give any inkling of what the book was about, and what the book was a cautionary tale about the horrors of overpopulation. And I found that very compelling, that book very compelling. That's another one I've been trying to get copies of from the used book market for my grandchildren to leave behind.
Doctor, at your age, is there anything that you wish you could have still accomplished but may not get the chance to do so?
Well, I am pushing hard to finish these last 2 books because, of course, I don't know how long I have. And I know that if I don't get them done, no one else will, namely the Denko family tales, the stories about everyone ancestral on the women's sides to the grandchildren, and the shortened form of the biography that I hope will be used in high schools and middle schools. And I hope to get them done. That's why I'm working away at them as hard as I can, as fast as I can. Also, I had another project that I am pretty sure I won't be able to finish. I had the idea when the grandchildren first started coming that I wanted to travel with each grandchild alone and with the parent of the same sex to an interesting part of the world, so that it wouldn't be 2 children interacting with each other instead of paying attention to what they were supposed to be learning about the animals, the country, and so on. And I did accomplish this with a granddaughter. When she was a few weeks short of 10, I took her to the southern end of Africa, to the countries of Namibia, Botswana, and Zambia, which is a marvelous place to see the African animals these days. And we did, and she did very well tracking the white rhinoceros with the group. And I really felt that she got a great deal out of it and was very happy with that. However, as more grandchildren came along, I changed my strategy a little bit. I organized a trip to Alaska that was intended to show the grandchildren the things that Chuck and I had done with our children when they were of about that age, although we camped up and back down the Alcan Highway, and I did this one through the Inland Passage and then flying home. And it included the Mendenhall Glacier, the animals, the Mount Denali, gold panning for gold, the huskies, husky puppies, and so on. Unfortunately, on that one, I had an accident and was unable to go along with them, but they did everything I had planned and arranged for them, and they were the ones who were supposed to see them anyway. And a year later, I took the same 3 to the Galapagos with the same intention that while I was able to do it and they were able to, they could see that interesting archipelago, that laboratory of evolution, and did, and I believe, again, got a great deal out of it. In addition, we went on the mainland to the equator, and the monument on the equator, and the demonstrations on the equator of how taking 2 steps south and the water will go the opposite way down the drain, 2 steps north, and it goes the other way down the drain, as we have been taught it's supposed to do. And so I've accomplished those, but what I can do with the 7-year-old, it will be years before he will be travel ready, not to mention the one that was 3 last week.
Well, I'm sure you have some fantastic stories to share with them.
When I get a chance, again, nothing is ideal, and we have not lived close enough that I would see them frequently for short intervals. When I see them, it's usually for a somewhat longer interval, but at greater time lapse. Sometimes I see one family at my summer place up on Beaver Island in the upper end of Lake Michigan, where they spend the summer, which is a lovely way to spend the summer, and I go up when I can for short periods up there and see them up there. The one who was in California, I'd have to make a trip or two a year out to see his children, but now he is in California. He is not in California anymore. He's in Columbus, Ohio, and therefore closer. Mm-hmm. And the one down in Costa Rica, that's a long distance. I have to plan trips down there to see how his little daughter is growing and progressing.
And lastly, before we end this meeting, to get to know the good doctor here, the physician, author, writer, and poet, what would you say to all of those young readers out there about pursuing their dreams and reaching their goals?
First of all, I don't make a distinction between career and the rest of life in terms of goals. It happens that in the book that I mentioned before, the Denko Family Tales, I do have a segment of advice, but this is much more than I can mention at this time, 80 or so bits of advice of different kinds, but several of those I can mention. One is something that I have run into by two other authors who both describe the same phenomenon, that as young men, they happen to be men, they thought of their life as being more or less on hold, and their real life would begin when they began their writing career, and then they suddenly realized, but this is my real life, and I should be beginning it now. One of these two was Marcel Proust, who wrote the monumental 7-volume work, À la recherche de la temps perdu, which is translated into English under a title that is not a translation of that, but it's called Remembrance of Things Past. And the other one is a modern author, a naturalized citizen here from India, Dinesh D'Souza, who described the same phenomenon, that his real life would start when he began writing his books, and then he realized, but my real life is now. And I encourage everyone, no matter what kind of goal they're thinking of pursuing, that now is the time to begin working toward it in whatever way, learning for it, saving money for it, and so on. I also make the point that every day of our life we are drawing another day out of our ever-dwindling account of days. And we never know the balance. And so I advise that we try to make every day pay its way in one way or another by not wasting it, by doing something of value in one or another of the categories. Another of the bits of advice I have comes from a book I have read only recently, and so I'll mention the author, who is Ron Paul, who has been in Congress and decided not to run again, as I'll explain in a minute. He believes that each of us should do whatever we can do better than anybody else. And we might do this within our life work by which we support ourselves, or maybe not. Maybe it has to be in addition to that. And his life story illustrates how this worked in his case. Ron Paul went to medical school and became a physician and specialized in obstetrics. He loved his career. He delivered the 5,000 or 6,000 babies that an obstetrician usually delivers in a lifetime, and they liked him, and people would come up and say, hello, you delivered me. And pretty soon he would be delivering the children of the children, and so on. but he was concerned about the terrible shape that our educational system is in.
Sure.
And he thought it was more important that other people could be delivering the babies, and he wanted to try to do something about the educational system. His first idea was to go to Congress and maybe make some changes in that way. When he got to Washington, he realized you can't do much in Congress these days. And so he did not run again, but he began working to help homeschooling projects, because he feels that homeschooling is not as difficult as it used to be for the family, which is difficult enough for, but it's becoming easier as there are more and more different curricula available. And he is now writing curricula that will meet the needs of different students. For example, he believes that if you have a student who is maybe in the upper third of the grade level and motivated, that such a student should be able to be pretty much in charge of his own education, not have to be taught by a teacher, but learn from a book, write a synopsis of what he has learned, and then that can be graded or observed by whoever is the teacher, in this case the mother or father, whoever is doing it, and that this person also should be learning to present his ideas in intelligible verbal form. And Dr. Paul thinks that they should be doing this by putting things on the internet, which is possible to do these days, and again, to have them corrected but also improved upon by whoever is taking the role of the teacher. And he believes also that while the student in the lowest grades is learning the mechanics, the reading, writing, and arithmetic, that they should also be learning things that the schools are not teaching now, namely the history of the country, the feeling for the country, the feeling of patriotism and love of country that the people in charge of education are taking a different stand about, that we are a bad country of bad white males. And Ron Paul says that there can be curricula that reflect the philosophy of the family in a way that sending your child to school can't do, because the school is operating perhaps under a different philosophy. And he is attempting to do the thing that nobody else is doing at this point, which is attempting to make it possible to bring children up with a love of country that they're not doing in schools. And many schools won't even do the Pledge of Allegiance, and so on and so on.
Right.
And I believe that this is a marvelous idea, this business of doing something either within your occupation or outside of your occupation that you see needs to be done and that you can do better than anybody else. And I hope that all of you will be doing what you can do better than anyone else. And I wish you success with that and good health, and God bless you.
And thank you. God bless you. And I think I can speak for myself for sure, and the many people that are watching. We will do our best to make this a better place.
And good luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you for your time, Doctor. It's been a pleasure.